There are sounds that history never forgets. The blast of a trumpet before a great battle. The roar of an earthquake that reshapes a nation. The cry of a king announcing victory. But nearly 2,000 years ago, another sound echoed through the streets of Jerusalem. It lasted only a few moments, yet its echo has reached every generation since. No one saw it coming. There were no dark clouds gathering over the city. No warning from the temple priests. No sign that heaven was about to interrupt the ordinary rhythm of the morning. Jerusalem had awakened as it always did during the Feast of Pentecost. Pilgrims crowded the streets. Merchants opened their stalls. Children laughed as they hurried beside their parents. The scent of fresh bread drifted from stone ovens. Roman soldiers watched from the fortress overlooking the temple. Everything seemed ordinary. Then, something happened. A sound descended from heaven. Luke, the physician who carefully recorded these events, chose his words with remarkable precision. He did not write that a violent wind swept through Jerusalem. Instead, he wrote, "Suddenly there came from heaven a sound like a mighty, rushing wind." It was a sound, not a storm. No roofs were torn away. No trees bent beneath its force. Yet everyone who heard it knew this was unlike anything they had ever experienced. What kind of sound could stop an entire city? Why did God choose to announce the arrival of His Spirit, not with fire first, but with a voice carried on the likeness of wind? To answer that question, we must return to a quiet room hidden above the streets of Jerusalem, where 120 believers were still waiting for a promise. Behind the crowded streets of Jerusalem, far from the noise of the temple, the upper room remained hidden in silence. The house itself was unremarkable. Rough limestone walls, heavy cedar beams, simple clay lamps. Nothing about it suggested that history was about to change. Inside, 120 believers waited together. Some knelt in quiet prayer. Others whispered the psalms they had known since childhood. No one knew how long they had been waiting. The days had begun to blur together. Morning became evening. Evening became another dawn. Yet no one left. Jesus had given only one instruction before He ascended into heaven. Do not leave Jerusalem. Wait for the gift my Father has promised. That promise echoed through every heart. But waiting is never easy. Peter stood near the window, looking down at the streets below. He could hear merchants calling to their customers, children laughing, the distant sound of silver trumpets from the temple. Life outside continued, as though nothing extraordinary was about to happen. John remained seated with a scroll resting across his knees. His eyes were closed. His lips moved silently in prayer. Near the center of the room, Mary sat with remarkable peace. She had learned long ago that God's greatest works often begin in silence. The room grew still. Even the whispered prayers began to fade. No one spoke. It was as if every person sensed that something was drawing near. Then, Peter lifted his head. At first, it was almost impossible to notice. A faint sound, so distant that no one could tell where it came from. It was not the voices outside, not the songs from the temple, not the footsteps in the streets below. The sound seemed to come from somewhere beyond the city itself. It grew steadily stronger, not suddenly, but with quiet determination. Every face turned toward the ceiling. No one moved. No one breathed a word. The room stood suspended between expectation and fulfillment. Whatever was coming was no longer far away. It was at the door. The sound continued to grow, not violently, but with an authority that demanded attention. No one had ever heard anything like it. It did not echo through the streets like thunder. It did not roll across the hills like an approaching storm. It filled the house itself, as though heaven had opened just beyond its walls. Luke, the careful historian who recorded these events, searched for words to describe what happened. Yet even he could only say, a sound like a mighty, rushing wind. Notice what he did not write. He never said that a powerful wind tore through Jerusalem. He never described dust swirling through the room. The windows did not shatter. The doors did not burst open. Instead, there was the unmistakable sound of overwhelming power. Throughout the scriptures, the image of wind had always carried deep meaning. In the opening pages of Genesis, the Spirit of God moved over the waters before creation began. The prophets spoke of God's breath bringing life to dry bones. Again and again, God's presence was revealed not because people could see Him, but because they experienced His power. Now, in this ordinary upper room, that same promise was unfolding once more. The believers could not control it. They could not predict it. They could only stand in awe as the sound surrounded them. Peter felt every fear he had carried since the crucifixion began to disappear. John sensed that the promise Jesus had spoken was no longer something to hope for. It had arrived. Around the room, Faces once marked by uncertainty slowly changed. Eyes widened, hands trembled, some fell to their knees. Others lifted their faces toward heaven. No one needed to explain what was happening. Every heart knew they were standing on holy ground.
Flying
the sound reached its fullness. For one breathtaking moment, time itself seemed to stand still. Then, something extraordinary appeared above them. Not lightning, not smoke, not the blinding glory that had once filled Solomon's temple. Something far more personal, something that would rest on every believer. The sound had filled the house. Now, every eye looked upward. No one spoke. No one dared to move. Then, something appeared. At first, it seemed almost impossible to describe. It was not lightning. It was not the blazing fire of a burning building. It was not the pillar of fire that had once guided Israel through the wilderness.
He is worthy to be
Luke searched for the closest comparison he could find. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire, what seemed to be not ordinary flames, not destruction, not judgment. The light separated, gently, silently, until it rested above each person in the room. Not only above Peter, not only above John, not only above the apostles. Every believer present received the same visible sign. Young and old, men and women, those who had followed Jesus from the beginning, and those who had joined later. No one was overlooked. The promise was not reserved for a chosen few. It was poured out upon all who were gathered in faith. The room glowed with a radiance unlike anything the disciples had ever seen. Yet the fire did not burn. No smoke filled the air. No heat forced them backward. Instead, the presence of God drew nearer than ever before. For centuries, God's glory had filled sacred places. The tabernacle in the wilderness, the temple built by Solomon, the Holy of Holies hidden behind the heavy curtain. Now, something extraordinary was taking place. God was no longer marking a building as his dwelling place. He was preparing his people to become his living temple. Then, in an instant, every fear dissolved, every doubt faded, every memory of failure lost its power. They were filled, not with excitement, not with emotion alone, but with the Holy Spirit, just as Jesus had promised. The frightened disciples who had once hidden behind locked doors were no longer the same people. A new chapter in history had begun, and outside, Jerusalem had no idea that everything was about to change. Outside the house, Jerusalem was already overflowing with pilgrims. For generations, the Feast of Pentecost had drawn Jewish families from across the known world. Some had traveled for weeks. Others had crossed the Mediterranean by ship. Many had returned to the city their ancestors once called home, though separated by distance. They all shared one faith, yet they no longer shared one language. In the crowded streets, voices blended together in a remarkable chorus. Greek, Aramaic, Latin, the dialects of Mesopotamia, the accents of Egypt, the languages of Asia Minor. Jerusalem had become a crossroads of nations. Then, the believers stepped out of the upper room. They were no longer hiding, no longer whispering behind closed doors. Something had changed. As they began to speak, the crowd slowed to a halt. At first, people simply listened. Then confusion spread from one face to another. A merchant from Alexandria suddenly heard the mighty works of God in the language of his childhood. A pilgrim from Rome looked around in disbelief. Visitors from Cappadocia exchanged astonished glances. Travelers from Parthia, Media, and Elam stood frozen where they were. One after another, each person heard the same message, not translated by an interpreter, not repeated through a chain of listeners. They heard it directly, in their own native tongue. The miracle was impossible to ignore. These men and women were Galileans, ordinary people. Most had never traveled beyond their own region. They had not studied the languages of distant nations. And yet, they spoke with remarkable clarity. The streets that only moments before had been filled with ordinary conversation, now echoed with praise to God in languages from across the known world. Some stared in silence. Others smiled through tears. Many simply asked the same question. How can this be? For centuries, language had divided nations. Now, for one extraordinary moment, language became the very bridge that united them. The city had come together for a festival, but heaven had gathered them for something far greater. For a few breathtaking moments, no one moved. The streets of Jerusalem, usually filled with conversation and celebration, fell into an uneasy silence. Thousands of eyes remained fixed on the followers of Jesus. Some listened with tears in their eyes. Others stood motionless, searching for an explanation that refused to come. They had traveled from distant lands. They knew these accents. They recognized these languages. Yet the people speaking them were unmistakably Galileans, ordinary fishermen, Tax collectors, men and women with no reputation as scholars or linguists. How could they possibly proclaim the wonders of God in languages they had never heard? The question spread through the crowd like ripples across still water. What does this mean? It was more than curiosity. It was a question that challenged everything they thought they knew about God. Had the age of the prophets returned? Was this the fulfillment of ancient promises? Could the followers of Jesus have been telling the truth all along? But not everyone was willing to ask those questions. Some folded their arms in disbelief. Others laughed nervously. A few shook their heads and searched for an easier explanation. One mocking voice rose above the crowd. "They have had too much wine." A ripple of laughter followed. It was easier to dismiss a miracle than to confront what it might mean. If these people were simply drunk, then no one needed to change. No one needed to reconsider who Jesus truly was. The laughter grew louder. It could not erase what thousands had already heard with their own ears. The miracle remained. The evidence stood before them. The city had reached a moment of decision. Would they believe? Would they walk away? Standing among the believers, Peter listened to every word. He remembered another crowd, another courtyard, another morning. Only weeks earlier, fear had silenced him. 3 times he had denied even knowing Jesus. 3 times he had chosen safety over truth. But the man standing here today was no longer the man who had wept in shame outside the high priest's house. The sound from heaven, the fire, the presence of the Holy Spirit had changed him. Peter stepped forward. The laughter faded. The murmuring stopped. Thousands turned toward the fisherman from Galilee. He drew a slow, steady breath. Then, he opened his mouth to speak.